This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video returns to lectures 6 to 8 and includes lectures 9 to 11 from Seminar 4. In the previous video, we began our consideration of a case study of a young woman who moved through 3 stages. We only addressed stage 1, in which at age 15 she became fond of a young boy, which Lacan interprets as being a substitute imaginary phallus who is put in relation to her own identified lack of one, all of which is structured by a symbolic relation between an imaginary mother and symbolic father. To make sense of this analysis, we considered what the phallus is and what it means for it to be raised to the level of symbolic gift. Now, in stage 2, the proverbial carpet is removed from under the young woman's feet as she must contend with the birth of a real younger brother, and thus the introduction of the real father, whose castrating effect deprives the young woman of her imaginary phallus, which can no longer be sustained in the boy she doted upon. The introduction of this imbalance led to a reconfiguration at the level of structure that will usher in stage 3. Ostensibly, the young woman falls in love with an older lady, not of high standing in society, a relationship that the young woman flaunts before her disapproving father. Lacan considers this transformation to be one from a relatively ordinary, non-pathological configuration to one that is structurally perverse. The perverse dimension of the case is not the same-sex attraction, which, as we learn from Freud, was already present prior to stage 2, and which is also present in another more famous case of Dora, who is considered to exhibit hysteric neurosis and not perversion. So what exactly then makes this case of the young woman one that entails perversion at a structural level? To answer this question will require understanding how perversion fits in with our ongoing consideration of the object and the encounter with lack, leading to a consideration of the fetish as an exemplary case of perversion. To understand perversion structurally, we have to once again return to the unfolding of lack, which I've decided now requires inviting a few terms into the discussion that won't get quite thematized until Seminar 5. But adding them here fills in the gaps, so to speak, of our understanding of lack that will make the analysis of the case much more accessible. The infant has real needs, and there are real objects that satisfy those needs. However, in the state of helplessness the infant finds itself in, it can't meet its own needs and so must express these needs to another who is able to provide the real object. This frustration of enjoyment gives rise to the articulation of need, which Lacan will name demand. But to speak, to become a speaking being, necessitates now the recognition of something other than the real object, the one who must receive the message. And this primal recognition of otherness is what leads the infant to demand more than the real object, to demand love. This remainder that demands love over and beyond the need for the real object is what Lacan names desire. Desire is not the same as love, but rather entails that excess over and beyond the physiological dimension of love. And there's always this excess because what one demands is nothing less than an unconditional, relentless kind of love. Herein we arrive at the fundamental lack that animates desire. And this lack has 2 dimensions. There is a realization of the lack of the primary other who desires something beyond the child, and then there's the lack of the child in coming to the realization that one can never be that something beyond which could fulfill the other. To understand perversion, we have to now reflect upon the various manners in which the subject responds to this lack, which unfolds in a logical sequence. The first time, in realizing there's lack in both the mother and the subject, there are attempts by the subject to become that which the mother lacks, and consequently in becoming it, the subject will also no longer lack. These attempts are inevitably futile, however, as the mother's desire cannot be placated by any of these attempts. We can never be enough for mommy. The second time arrives as the imaginary father intervenes as a rival to the child that castrates the mother's desire by denying access to the phallic object. The third step involves the real father that comes in to say, not only is the mother prohibited from access to the phallic object, but you, the subject, are prohibited from trying to become that object. This allows a child to move beyond the rivalrous identification with the imaginary phallus to now locate the symbolic phallus in another, the symbolic father with whom the subject becomes identified with, a point that is important soon as we'll return to the case of the young woman. The imaginary identification with a symbolic figure, in a sense, lifts the subject outside of the immersion of imaginary relations, providing the proper distance for metaphorical substitutions that will function for the subject to greater or lesser degrees of success. Now, it should be noted here that what makes the imaginary phallus imaginary is that it doesn't belong to either man or woman. Both the subjects are castrated, both lack the phallus, though their respective relations to this lack are different, which in part accounts for the difference in sexuation itself. It was the YouTuber and blogger The Dangerous Maybe who pointed out to me that the imaginary phallus is a kind of masculine substance, something that is more than a man, but that makes one what he called the man. This is why he claims the truth of subjectivity is femininity. I think this is a very convincing presentation of the meaning of the imaginary phallus. The only thing I would add right now is that femininity here cannot be defined relative to masculinity. And so this concept of femininity would have to be something other than what most of us think of it to be, since most of our conceptions of femininity are framed relative to a binary. There's much more here, and I'll encourage you to check out his blog. I'll put the link to it below in the description. What happens in perversion at this third step of the Oedipal complex then is, instead of accepting that the symbolic father has the phallus, and thus the subject is fundamentally castrated, the subject returns to the first step and vacillates between identifying with the imaginary phallus and identifying with the mother. Rather than the phallus be located elsewhere with the big other of the symbolic father, the symbolic object is instead reduced to a privileged image. According to the DSM-5, a fetishistic disorder entails recurrent, intense sexual arousal from either the use of non-living objects or a highly specific focus on non-genital body parts, manifested by fantasies, urges, or behaviors, and which causes clinically significant distress. As was the case with psychosis, to understand the psychoanalytic approach to clinical conditions, we have to move away from such a symptom and behavior-based approach to diagnosis. In other words, one has to theorize and not simply describe and classify. That lack of theory governing the DSM leads to all sorts of problems, from proper classifications to a superficial understanding of what us psychologists call comorbidity, that is, when an individual qualifies for multiple diagnoses. From a treatment perspective, knowing that someone has a diagnosable fetishistic disorder, or any other disorder for that matter, yields limited information if one cannot situate these clusters of symptoms within some larger organizing categories. Of course, because such categories are not, in general, empirically demonstrable, and there are numerous competing systems of thought proposing such categories, it's often easier to simply let that go in favor of treating symptoms. The distinctive Lacanian approach considers those larger organizing categories as consisting of a structure that involves the intersubjective relationships and identities, imaginary, as they come to be mediated by elementary rules and signs governed by implicit authority, symbolic, all of which is uniquely constituted around excessive and incomprehensible events and traumas, the real, resulting in a particular constitution of the subject as split between that which is allowed to enter into those intersubjective relationships and those that are repressed, as in neurosis, disavowed, as in perversion, or in the case of psychosis, how such a mediating authority is foreclosed upon and gets overtly expressed in intersubjective relations. It's believed that these underlying structures, however one wants to define them, can get played out in a variety of ways, many of which can look very similar from a perspective relying on the DSM or other kinds of diagnostic nomenclatures. So how are we to understand the function of the fetish? The split in the subject I just mentioned entails a kind of lack, a lack that is induced by the depriving and castrating effects of authority. However, what if there was a way to trick this authority by tricking myself into imagining I never lost what I have been deprived of? What if I don't have to accept such lack, but can instead find something that confirms that I truly am the imaginary phallus, or that I truly have it? The fetishist elevates a real object whose symbolic function is to substitute for the imaginary phallus that is lacking. Two important concepts need to be addressed to flesh out this consideration of the fetish: screen memories and the schema of the veil. The fetish is a projected image constituted by what is called a screen memory. The screen memory is a kind of exceptionally clear but distorted visual memory, often of a traumatic nature, in which some symbolic elements are arrested as the flow of memory is frozen and reduced to a still point. Lacan provides an example of how, in film, the movie can be speeding along as normal until suddenly everything comes to a stop, capturing the characters in a freeze frame. In film, such freeze frames are a way of adding dramatic effect and displacing attention away from the overall narrative toward a singular point in time. This freeze frame clinically entails an interruption in the subject's history. The image fixated upon becomes central in the formation of a fantasy invested with erotic values. As a kind of detached signifier from the rest of the signifying chain, the image selected is of a metonymical character, something merely contiguously connected with the situation and with the rest of the chain, linked by temporal and spatial associations rather than by metaphor. The screen memory serves as a kind of basis upon which the fetish object is selected, and so the memory may be of the hem of the mother's dress, no higher than the ankle, where the shoe meets, etc. The function of this scene, Lacan states, is that it veils castration. How so? By serving as an interruption, the ensuing sequence of the signifying chain, which continues on, that is, the history that goes on for the subject, becomes obfuscated, especially the Oedipal drama of castration. In other words, the function of the fetish in serving as the site of imaginary projection is to create the illusion of a presence in place of that lack that is beyond the object. If you recall, when it comes to the symbolic gift, one loves the object for what it lacks, for what is beyond it. The fetish intercedes here to take the place of this lack, rendering the symbolic gift fully present and available. The fetish offers us insight into the clinical structure of perversion. Not all subjects with fetishes necessarily have a perverse structure, and not all perverse structures entail fetishism, as we'll see in the case study. Nonetheless, the general logic of the fetish offers an exemplary understanding for how such a dynamic may be played out in a broader fashion. Perversion, Lacan tells us, entails the valorization of the image in which the signifying chain of the subject's history is reduced to a pure sign, oriented to the covering over of lack through these metonymical substitutions of an object that takes the place of such lack. A perverse structure is not equivalent to what society considers to be perverse, since such acts can be performed by subjects without a perverse structure, and those with a perverse structure may not engage in such acts. Rather, perversion is defined first and foremost in relation to the normalizing values of the Oedipus complex, in which the subject has a distinct relationship with the law as the prohibition of enjoyment. Whereas the neurotic structure displays a conflictual and ambivalent relation to the law, the pervert denies castration by making enjoyment the law. There will be, in general, much more to flesh out here as we continue on. So I would recommend considering this a launching point rather than any kind of comprehensive examination of what will ultimately be Lacan's more developed views on the matter of perversion. But it will probably be helpful now to take up the case of the young woman and see how it reflects this clinical structure of perversion. Once the real younger boy sibling is introduced and the boy she doted upon could no longer symbolically function as the imaginary phallus, an unconscious choice is presented to the young woman: either remain in the structural configuration but find another more acceptable object that can substitute for the loss, or undergo a complete transformation of the structural configuration itself. And it would seem that the latter is the one decided upon. Rather than be the one seeking to receive what she lacks, she instead becomes the one who now possesses the imaginary phallus by identifying with the father at the level of the ego and finds an object, the older woman, the imaginary little other, for whom she can love not for what she has, but for what she lacks. This lack in the object constitutes the location of the symbolic phallus, which is situated at the level of the big other. For this, I gather that perversion is not a complete failure to recognize lack, but only its disavowal on one side of the imaginary relation. Hence why in perversion there is either an identification with the father as the one who can give to another who lacks by being the one who doesn't lack, or identifying with the mother as the one who lacks but disavow the lack in the other who most certainly possesses what one lacks. Hence the duality of perversions: masochism, sadism, exhibitionism, voyeurism, etc. How are we to understand this transformation? It was enacted by the traumatic intrusion of the real, what Lacan calls here the fatal moment. In this case, the real function of the father manifesting at the arrival of the younger sibling. The young woman is frustrated by this arrival of the real child, but rather than accept privation and castration as would be the ordinary course of unfolding, the young woman instead identifies with the imaginary phallus who can now be the instrument of the other's satisfaction. The exhibitionistic quality by which the young woman displays her affection for the older woman then seeks to demonstrate to her father what true love is, perhaps as a way of being the castrating agent herself, though this is not explicitly stated in the text. However, once the older woman rejects her upon encountering the disapproving look of her father, the young woman can no longer sustain any imaginary path for her desire. The object is completely lost, confronting her with a definitive privation. As far as I understand it, what makes this case one entailing a perverse structure is the following. First, it is perverse in relation to the ordinary formulation of the Oedipal drama. This is not intended to say that the ordinary course of things is better, only that within the given symbolic Lacan is considering, it is normalizing, and this ordinary course leads most often to neurosis. And herein leads to the second reason we are dealing with a perverse structure. The subject here is not in doubt, like the neurotic, is not confronted by a question as one finds in the case of Dora, for example. Instead, she unquestioningly assumes her identity as one who possesses the phallus, veiling, therefore, her own lack. Additionally, she seems in a sense, fully aware of what she is doing with regard to antagonizing her father and verbalizes with full confidence to Freud her intent to continue on with her course of action. It's one of the reasons why subjects with a perverse structure are often not quite amenable to analysis like neurotics are. Third, we find in the case a surplus of the real, which is insufficiently symbolized and thus gets placed back into the imaginary as a kind of fixed image. From what I gather of this case, there does not seem to be a fetish here, but instead an identification with an imaginary phallus that emerges from the appearance of the real phallus, that being associated with the real sibling and the real father. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. And as always, be well.